Welcome to the Calm Analytics channel. Boris Tiesenghausen is here with you. Today is July 18th. Here are the main news stories at this moment. So, in response to the terrorist attacks by the Russian Federation on our civilian infrastructure, our homes, our logistics and postal terminals, our drones have finally struck logistics facilities in the Moscow and so far Tambov regions. And the fire is so intense, it seems as if there are not only civilian goods stored in those warehouses. Let's watch a video of how a volcano woke up in the Moscow region. Who writes like that? Beautiful. I think everyone in Moscow can see it now. Well, the second largest Wildberries warehouse in Russia was attacked. This happened in the city of Elektrostal. Plus, an oil depot in Noginsk was attacked, which is very important for Muscovites, by the way. And also the Wildberries warehouse in Kotovsk. That's in the Tambov region. I would still pay special attention to the oil depot. It's key for supplying petroleum products to Moscow, especially since 4 refineries that used to supply fuel to Moscow have been shut down. This is a very painful blow. Interestingly, about a week ago, Wildberries updated its contract with sellers. I think you read that news. They freed themselves from responsibility for goods that might be damaged due to drone attacks. Their new contract came into effect on July 7th. So Wildberries won't compensate sellers whose goods were destroyed. That's how it happened, almost as if they knew in advance. And Putin simply forgot to tell Russians, or rather didn't think it necessary to say, that Russians will have to pay for this war, and they're already doing so. Out of curiosity, I read the comments and watched videos, including those from Russian entrepreneurs who had goods stored in those warehouses. No one is directly naming who is to blame. Here's a comment, for example, goods worth several million burned down. I don't know what to do. What is there to say here? When you finally figure out what to do and with whom, that's when everything will stop burning. For several years, you've been pretending not to understand what's happening, what to do, and so on. At the very least, that's strange. But I want to say that with every such strike, whether on oil refineries or on logistics hubs, understanding comes. Slowly but surely it is reaching the Russians. You know, it's like a blurry object gradually coming into sharper focus. And when it comes to the question of who is really to blame for all this, more and more often the focus is on that disgusting, Botoxed face with empty eyes and cheeks like 2 billiard balls. By the way, there have been a lot of comments from Russians calling to end the war. This all needs to be finished. Who needs this? How long can we keep fighting? And so on. In other words, nobody cares anymore about those 8 years, about the Donbas, about NATO, about biolabs. See how everything has changed. Maybe someday I'll finally hear an answer from Russians. Why does NATO at Russia's borders only bother Russians selectively? That is, depending on which country NATO is in. During Putin's time in power, the number of NATO countries in the bloc has exactly doubled from 16 to 32. But here's what I just can't understand, and probably Russians themselves can't understand either. Why is it that NATO in Poland at Russia's borders, there's the Kaliningrad region, NATO in Latvia, NATO in Lithuania, in Estonia, in Norway, and now in Finland doesn't bother Russians and they don't attack these countries? But the possible hypothetical accession of Ukraine to NATO worries them so much. No one knows. It's just some kind of mystery. By the way, friends, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. It helps promote the channel. It helps in the fight against Putin's propaganda. You can do it right now, subscribe, and don't put it off for later. So make sure to subscribe. Hundreds of Russian entrepreneurs are writing that they had goods worth huge amounts of money. Now no one will give it back to them. And you know what some of them are writing? Well, they're being careful about it. Like there's money for drones and missiles, but not to compensate us. Oh, you see, they're starting to get it. They understand perfectly well, or probably always did, that burning down warehouses and terminals of Nova Poshta in Ukraine with impunity would have consequences. Sooner or later they would have to answer for it. Well, here you go. The fact that Wildberries managed to update its contract with companies is no coincidence, of course. It's not just management paranoia. It means that the company's leadership, which has very close ties to the Russian leadership, knew that there would be retaliatory attacks. But they didn't tell the Russian people anything, just like Putin never says anything. They took care of themselves, but not of the small entrepreneurs. Well, that's always how it is in Russia. These small ones, they're just victims and will put up with anything. And I guess it's no secret to you that warehouse complexes on the scale of Wildberries are almost inevitably mixed with parallel logistics, what they call in Russia dual-use goods. Basically, all that stuff also works for the front lines. So there you have it. Now, a bit of statistics for those who complain and say how bad Ukraine is. How could this possibly be? There are poor entrepreneurs over there after all. But before I get to the statistics, let me make another rather disappointing conclusion for Russians for the near future. So, here are the statistics. These are by no means all the sites that have been attacked in Ukraine just recently. In May, in Dnipro, the UN Humanitarian Warehouse. On May 25th, the World Food Programme Warehouse of the UN, also in Dnipro. On May 31st in Dnipro, the Nova Poshta Warehouse. On June 12th in Zaporizhzhia, the Nova Poshta Terminal. On June 15th in Kyiv, the largest Nova Poshta sorting terminal. On June 17th in Sumy, the Nova Poshta sorting terminal. On July 2nd in Kyiv, the Nova Poshta Logistics Center and the Ukrainian Red Cross Humanitarian Warehouse. They fired with direct aim. Oh, on July 5th and 6th, the Nova Poshta Terminal in Chernihiv and also the Nova Poshta Terminal in Dnipro. On July 7th, in Kryvyi Rih, the Nova Poshta Sorting Center. In general, in Dnipro in July, already the World Food Programme Warehouse of the UN. And that's just in recent times, and by far not all the sites. That is, the World Food Programme itself, the UN program, says there have been at least 7 attacks on its attention, clearly marked facilities. And that's just in 3 months. So they knew there was food, they knew it was a humanitarian mission, and they still struck there. So the hour of reckoning has come. I think that along with the oil refineries, they will now start burning down the largest warehouses of Russian retailers as well. Not just Wildberries, by the way. Well, as I understand it, these are far from all the surprises Ukraine has in store for the near future. I'll say right away that there is simply no physical way to protect such facilities in Russia. Everything will burn. So now people in Russia are asking themselves, if 2 Wildberries warehouses were burned down in a single day, does that mean all major warehouses will be burned? And what do you think, friends? Write your answer in the comments. And I think it's not just Wildberries, who's their competitor, Ozon, and basically everyone on the list. Ukraine is asymmetrically breaking Russia's war strategy, turning the tide of this war, and soon will reach the Black Sea. The Russians are having very big problems there as well. In every episode, we have an important fundraiser for the defense forces of Ukraine. We are continuing to raise funds for a pickup truck for the soldiers of the tank battalion of the 31st Separate Mechanized Brigade. Unfortunately, their vehicle was recently destroyed. Now they need our help, so let's get involved. And the soldiers have recorded a video message for you. Please take a look.
Бажаю здоров'я, ми бійці відділення Церберу з 31-ї МБР разом з Борисом Тізенхаузеном та 24-м каналом відкрили збір на автомобіль, який допоможе в виконанні наших бойових задач. Долучайтесь, разом ми сила. Слава Україні! Героям слава!
Let's help our soldiers. I'm messaging with Artur from this brigade, telling him that the fundraiser is launching soon, very soon. He says, thank you so much. And he sends you all his regards and thanks, and so do I. The link to the fundraiser is in the description of this video. There are mono, private, and PayPal options for those who want to help from abroad, and a QR code in the corner. It also leads to the fundraiser. That's for those watching on another channel. No one has forgotten about the tankers in the Black Sea and the Azov Sea. In other words, the Black Sea continues to be cleansed of Russian filth. Last night alone, 13 ships were taken out. That's very serious. Do you know how many in total already? 172 ships since the start of the operation. It's just incredible. Last night, 8 dry cargo ships in the Black Sea were hit, 1 oil tanker in the Azov Sea, a gas tanker, 2 floating cranes, and a tugboat. All of this is in the Black Sea. Beautiful. Just amazing. And here's another piece of news that's related to this. The Russians realize that at this rate, they'll soon be left without a fleet at all. They've already lost it in the Azov Sea, and now they'll lose it in the Black Sea. In an urgent move, the Russians are redeploying UAV units from the front to protect their ships. Madhya writes that to protect the fleet, Russia is being forced to transfer up to 200 Rubicon UAV crews. That's quite a substantial group. They're redeploying from the front, strengthening air defense in the areas where the ships are based. Overall, this is great news, pulling Russian UAV crews, 200 of them, over there. Well, I hope now they'll start taking out both tankers and enemy UAV crews. It's extremely difficult to defend at sea. But here's an interesting question. Will they redeploy UAV crews to the rear to guard warehouses, oil depots, maybe other facilities? There just aren't that many of them. There simply aren't. Our armed forces have stretched the entire Russian air defense system so thin that they don't even know where to cover anymore. Moreover, keep in mind that every day several more elements of the air defense system are being destroyed. This is happening most actively in Crimea, and now we have a news segment from the Crimean partisans, from our friends. The Crimean partisans are a partisan movement in Crimea with a very extensive network across the entire occupied peninsula. All of them are bringing Ukraine's victory closer. And it's not just those who derail enemy military trains, but also those who obtain very, very valuable information for us. Here's a news block from our friends, the Crimean partisans. So, Chronicles of the Gasoline Wastelands. In Crimea and Sevastopol, people have started discussing an interesting scheme for subsidizing fuel. In other words, it's a complete collapse over there. They tried to bring fuel there somehow. So, the idea was simple. They wanted to pay these federal, 80-something rubles per liter to the suppliers, so that gas stations on the occupied peninsula would basically get fuel for free. Well, that's the kind of subsidy it was. But the scheme wasn't launched. Do you know why? They immediately saw the problem that there was too great a risk that this free, conditionally free gasoline for Crimea simply wouldn't make it there. It would be sold off right on the territory of the Russian Federation, still on the mainland. And the scheme would suddenly turn from a way to save the occupied peninsula into just another way to make money. Can you imagine? So that's why the scheme wasn't launched. They don't abandon their own. Think about it. The scheme didn't work because Russians immediately assumed that other Russians from the mainland would steal from the newly arrived Russians in occupied Crimea. Meanwhile, fuel prices at gas stations in Crimea continue to rise completely unchecked. And here's another piece of news. It's telling and extremely interesting. The migration of military personnel in Crimea. Crimea is becoming emptier, both in terms of tourists and now military personnel as well. It's becoming increasingly noticeable in Crimean cities that there are fewer and fewer soldiers on the streets. Across the peninsula, as the saying goes, a little bird told me that the families of military personnel have started to be evacuated in advance, so as not to cause unnecessary panic. And just in case, while the bridge is still standing. That is, the authorities are now spreading a certain version of events, even among their own people, claiming that the military and police are being transferred from Crimea to the resorts of Krasnodar Krai, because Crimea has suspended the reception of children, and so the security forces need to be relocated there, as they are supposedly more needed there, and so on. So, the explanation sounds somewhat careful, but there are still a lot of unanswered questions. And this is despite the fact that the military leadership and the heads of Russian special services in Crimea have already sent their families to Russia, supposedly on vacation, but they never returned from that vacation. They are staying in the Russian Federation, and on top of that, the situation with the electricity has become even more complicated. This local leftover, the so-called governor of Sevastopol, Razvozayev, announced that due to a critical shortage, it is no longer possible to stick to the blackout schedule, where electricity was supplied for 6 hours a day. I just want to remind you that 3 weeks ago, Aksionov was saying that everything would soon return to normal, and that people just needed to be a little patient. There will be electricity and will be flooded with fuel. Well, now it's only going to get worse. We warned you. But there's another piece of news that's very telling. Russia is preparing not only to buy gasoline abroad, but also diesel, which means things are much, much worse. Why? Because historically, Russia has been one of the largest exporters of diesel. About 50% of the fuel produced was exported abroad. Just imagine, that's how much it was. And now, not only can they not export that amount, they don't even have enough for themselves. For example, in 2023, I checked domestic diesel consumption in Russia was 52 million tons, while 36 million were exported. So now that amount that used to go for export is gone. Can you imagine how much processing capacity has decreased? Not only is there nothing to send for export, there's not enough even for domestic needs. That's something. And once they use up their reserves, they're done for. Basically, Russia is now urgently looking for someone to sell them both gasoline and diesel. They're begging India. Can you imagine that? Putin has driven Russia into a critical dependence on China, into a truly crippling dependence, and now he's about to make it critically dependent on India as well. A great, great geostrategist. And here's a wonderful, purely Russian news item on this topic. Residents of Volgograd recorded an appeal near a gas station to the head of the investigative committee, Bastrikin, complaining about high gasoline prices. Soon after, police arrived at the gas station, detained the Volgograd residents, accused them of holding an unauthorized rally, and arrested them for 5 days. And well, that's how it is. Bastrikin, what were they recording? Like, Bastrikin, please tell Putin that it's all the bad gas station owners raising the prices. That's the real reason for the crisis. Maybe Putin doesn't know about it at all. How pathetic and hopeless they are. By the way, in Russia, there's even a conspiracy theory about those burned Wildberries warehouses. Because they also have Ozon, the main competitor of Wildberries. And I came across a theory. What if it was Ozon who smashed up Wildberries warehouses under the cover of all this noise? After all, it's competition. You know, the most interesting thing is that right now in Russia, nothing would be burning at all. Not Ozon, not Wildberries, not oil refineries, nothing. They'd be making tons of money, there wouldn't be any sanctions, and they'd be traveling all over the world. The life of every Russian is getting worse every day, solely because Putin decided to attack Ukraine and doesn't know how to get out of this war. He knows, but he doesn't want to. And here's proof that things are going to get even worse for Russians. And it'll get worse for us too. But we'll manage. Putin understands that at this rate, it's the end of the line for him and for Russia. So what's happening? Everything is burning, everything is falling apart, the front is at a standstill. That's why, with a high degree of probability, they're preparing a new mobilization. The Center for Countering Disinformation reports that Putin is preparing to mobilize 500,000 Russians this fall. Some of them will be sent straight to the front, others will be trained for up to a month. I don't know, they won't be very well trained. And maybe, after these ones die right away, then they'll send the others to the front too. I think many people understand that those who go into the assaults right away will simply be wiped out immediately. They won't last long. According to statistics, the average life expectancy of a Russian assault trooper is 27 minutes. Naturally, there will be no talk of any payments there anymore. Everything has already been paid out. Now they're only cutting payments. Basically, Putin, just think about it, wants to kill another 500,000 Russians just to capture a few more Ukrainian settlements. Obviously, this doesn't make any sense. It defies all logic and common sense. But logic left the chat and Putin's bald head a long time ago. And here's another piece of news about the craftiest guy on the planet. At border gas stations in Belarus, a fuel limit has been introduced. Well, obviously, this limit is for Russians who want to cross the border into Belarus to fill up their tanks. So you're not brothers after all, Russians. They've set a limit just for you. Well, what can you do? Business is business. So Lukashenko is acting anything but brotherly toward the Russians. And in the end, he'll probably just say, they made me do it. I didn't want to. They're not my brothers. And anyway, I'll tell you everything. Just show me where to sign. That's exactly how it'll be. 200% when he starts singing in The Hague. And you, friends, take care of yourselves and your loved ones. Subscribe to this channel, don't forget. And I ask you very much, let's support our fighters from the 31st Brigade. They are in urgent need of transportation right now. The link to donate is in the description of this video. Have a peaceful day, everyone, and glory to Ukraine.